Hello and welcome. Now, for the past almost 2 months, I've been putting up Atlantic Fleet videos, and even before that, some months ago, I made a video about, the history of battleships and some of their myths. While that video covered a lot of stuff about battleships and explained a lot of things that the general public doesn't tend to know, I think there are some things here and there that might be, well, worth another video. Not a monographic video about just one topic, but one that covers several different ones of them. There are a lot of ongoing things going around about certain historical ships. There's a certain lore attached to some ships. There's also a certain degree of, I'm not going to say lack of knowledge, but rather misunderstanding of historical facts. Now, obviously, that comes from people who don't really know both the details of naval architecture or the historical context where those ships happen to exist. So I'm going to touch some of those, and I'm going to try to make an entertaining video about that, or at least about some of those topics. Now, this video came to my mind that I needed to do a revisit of some of the historical myths about battleships. When in one of my videos about Atlantic Fleet, where Hood was fighting, in the comment section someone said she was a battlecruiser. And yeah, that's one of the instances of lore that never goes away. Hood was a battlecruiser. Well, no, she wasn't. Now, to do this properly, I would need maybe a couple of hours speaking about the history of naval combat up to the 1905, 1905, 1906, 1907. But I'm not going to do that because that would take a lot and I want to be a little bit brief. So I will just discuss the technical details, okay? Now, everyone, when you speak about battle cruisers, everyone thinks about the British conception of the battlecruiser. Now, the British conception of the battlecruiser, which comes from the mind and the ideas, especially from someone in particular, that someone being the several times First Lord of the Admiralty, Admiral Jackie Fisher. Well, the British battlecruiser essentially was a very big ship, larger actually. They ended up being bigger than the battleships of the era, which had capital sized guns, which means 11, 12, 13, 15 inch guns. They had cruiser speed, we are speaking 25 to 30 knots in the early 20th century, and had very, very poor armor for a battleship standard. For instance, let's do a comparison here. A normal armor belt for a battleship of the same era of Invincible was 12 inches of belt. There were several battleships with that thickness. Invincible had 6. Obviously, what we are looking at is a glass cannon, something which can hit extremely hard, but when hit, well, yeah, it doesn't last a lot. Hood initially was going to be one of those. It was intended to be a very fast ship with not that much armor and 8 15-inch guns, which by the time were the largest guns afloat and the best. The British 15-inch gun of World War I was exceptional. She was decently armored for a battlecruiser of the time, but even then she was a pure battlecruiser. We are speaking about a planned belt, for instance, of 9 inches, I think 9.5 inches of belt armor. Obviously, the initial project when the ship was started, yes, was a battle cruiser. But then was changed because something happened, and that something was Jutland. Actually, Jutland happened almost at the same time that Hood was laid down. So as soon as the news of the battle came back with the news that 3 battle cruisers, British battle cruisers, had blown up, well, work immediately stopped because the reports were saying that something was fundamentally wrong in the British battlecruiser. Meanwhile, on the other side of the North Sea, the Germans were celebrating a victory, which is highly debatable if that was a victory or not, but at any rate, they had lost only one battlecruiser, and that was through progressive flooding, not through a catastrophic explosion like in the case of the British battlecruisers. Now, if we look at the different conceptions of battlecruisers, there's the British battlecruiser, the one we spoke about, and then there's the German battlecruiser. Now, where the British battlecruiser carried battleship guns with cruiser speed and very poor armor for a ship of that size, German battlecruisers were slower than British battlecruisers, had lighter guns than British battlecruisers, but had much thicker armor. The end result was a ship which was as resilient as a battleship, but faster, because what she sacrificed was essentially weapons. Um, and that obviously made for a much more survivable ship. Now, the British didn't know exactly all the specs of the German warships at the time. They were in the middle of a war versus Germany. Obviously, the specs of the German ships were a matter of, well, trying to find them out through intelligence, whatever. But the British knew the German battlecruisers were better armored than their own. And they obviously knew that their own concept of battlecruiser was not going to be successful because the first time those battlecruisers had been engaged in a major fleet operation, 3 of them had essentially blown up. So after the review and the commission that investigated Jutland and decided they came to the conclusion that simply the battlecruisers were flawed, that the whole concept was not workable because those ships couldn't stand in a battle line, and if they were not going to stand in a battle line, they didn't need battlecruisers guns. They could do with something lighter. So from then on, the British concept of a battlecruiser changed, and they came very close to the German concept. That is, a ship which is as well armored as a battleship, but is much faster, and not sacrificing anything. The Germans sacrificed weapons. For instance, der Flinker, which was a German battlecruiser of the Lutzow class, she had 8 12-inch guns. Meanwhile, the contemporary German battleship, which was Kaiser, had 10 12-inch guns. So they had slightly lighter protection, they had less guns, but they had a lot more speed. And that was the German approach, something almost as well protected as a battleship, not as well armed, but much faster. And the British took a look at that and said, okay, we want battlecruisers which are as fast as a cruiser, has the same armor as a battleship, but we don't want to sacrifice weapons. What ended up happening was that Hood was the biggest ship in the world for 20 years. Because to mix very high speed, the same guns as a battleship, and the same armor as a battleship, you needed a lot of displacement. Obviously, Hood was almost 48,000 tons. I mean, she was bigger than Bismarck, actually, in length, at least. So yeah, they ended up with a ship that big. Why? Well, because the British battlecruiser concept had evolved into something that today we know as fast battleship. But the British didn't see it that way. They were still calling them battlecruisers, even while she had everything a battleship had, plus speed. So, fast battleship. What happened was that Hood was given exactly, even in some places slightly improved, the same armor scheme of protection that the Revenge class battleships have. So we are again looking at a ship with battleship armor, because Revenge was a battleship. Hood had the same armor layout. she just had a lot more armor because she had to cover a much bigger hull. But the layout was the same. So Battleship armor. Revenge had 8 15-inch guns. Hood had 8 15-inch guns. Battleship weapons. Hood was able to steam at more than 30 knots when she was commissioned. That's cruiser-like speed. And that's for the British, the Battlecruiser. Now, roughly months, actually, less than a year after Hood was commissioned into the Royal Navy, an international conference was started in Washington, which is nowadays called the Washington Naval Treaties. There were several treaties going on: the 3-power agreement, the 4-power agreement, the 5-power agreement, the 9-power agreement, whatever. What came out of that meeting was a ban on battleship construction for 15 years. Exception made for some things here and there. The Japanese already had 16-inch battleships, the Nagatos. The Americans had already 16-inch battleships, the Colorados. The British didn't have any new battleship other than Hood. Even while Hood was considered the most powerful ship of her era because she didn't have the big guns, but she had battleship armor, very good guns, and extraordinary speed. But the British were given the chance to build a battleship. 2 battleships, actually. To match the 2 American Colorados and the 2 Japanese Nagatos. These ships came to be known as the Nelsons. But the Nelsons weren't designed after the naval treaty was signed. Actually, the Nelsons are a cut down version of a previous design the British were working on. After World War I, for the new generation of British capital ships, the British came with 2 different models. Actually, they came with a lot of them, but they decided for 2. The G3 class battlecruiser and the N3 class battleship. The N3 class battleship had a monster amount of armor, monster guns, 18-inch guns, and a turn-off speed of roughly from 21 to 23 knots. Meanwhile, the G3 had almost the same kind of armor the N3 had, 16-inch guns, and almost 30 knots of speed. Of course, they were monster ships. The G3 were rated at around 48,000 tons in standard displacement and almost 54,000 tons in deep displacement, in deep load displacement. So it was a monster of a ship. It was very big, it was very heavy, very large, but it was a battlecruiser. And I'm not making this up. This thing had 14 inches of belt armor, up to 8 inches of deck armor in some points, obviously not on all the areas, but on the critical areas, 8 inches of deck armor. They had up to 17 inches of turret armor, and well, they had I think around 13 inches bulkheads, something like that. I don't know. The thing is, that thing was the most armored thing in the world, and the British were calling it a battlecruiser. Why? Again, battleship guns, not as big as the N3 class. They were 16-inch guns, not 18, but still were 16-inch guns, battleship guns. Cruiser speed, those ships could theoretically make up to 32 knots. And more than battleship armor, right? What happened was, obviously, after the Washington Naval Conference, neither the N3s nor G3s could be built because the new limit for battleships was at 35,000 tons standard. So what they did was take the G3, they cut it down, they got all the speed out of the window, and they ended up with a small, bastardic, pretty bad version of G3, which could make 23 knots at the most, but had 9 16-inch guns. So what we can see here is a trend, okay? Hood was called a battlecruiser because the British were calling it a battlecruiser, or calling her. I don't know. I tend to call ships by it. Sorry. I should say her, but whatever. Yeah, the British classification for battlecruiser now wasn't anymore light armor ships with very heavy guns and very fast. Now were battleships with very fast speed. And that was what Hood was. Now, of course, now you are going to come and tell me, well, but Bismarck sank her in one shot, so she must have had a very crappy armor. Well, what we are looking at is that Bismarck she had Revenge in front of her, she would have been able to blow it up in one shot. Exactly the same as she did on Hood. And Revenge was a battleship. No one is going to discuss that, right? Why? Because Revenge was able to make 22 knots at the most. And that in the best of times, because by World War II, more than 20 knots for those ships were quite a challenge. The problem was not that Hood was a battlecruiser, because he was not. He was a battleship, just called or labeled as a battlecruiser. But hey, who are we to discuss? The British use them, right? So they should know what those ships were. The problem again is that the denomination for those ships didn't happen to come around for 20 more years. After the Washington Treaty elapsed, 15 years after its signature, in the mid 30s, well, the new generation of battleships started happening. Nations around the world started building battleships again. And the new battleships had one thing in common. They all had speed over 27 knots. All of them. Look at them, one by one. In the American class, in the American case, North Carolina, 28 knots. South Dakota, sorry, 27.5. KGB, 28.5. Litorios, 31. Richelieu's, 30. Yamatos, even while the Yamato wasn't really compliant with any treaty, but whatever, 27 knots. Germans, Scharnhorst, 32 knots. Bismarck's, 30 knots. What happened is that 15 years have done miracles for technology, and now the machinery could be much more powerful in much smaller spaces. If you can put more power in less space, you don't need that much more armor to cover all the vital spaces, so you can make a smaller ship while being faster. And what happened was that much better armored ships than Hood took on the seas with speeds that weren't that slow compared with Hood's 30 knots. In some cases, actually were superior, like in Richelieu's case or Litorio's case. So, the mid-30s generation of battleships are called the fast battleships. But if you're looking at the things with a perspective, and you see that by 1919, the British were actually completing a ship with battleship armor, cruiser speed, and battleship guns, we have to reach one conclusion, and that's that the first fast battleship ever happened to be HMS Hood. She was a battleship. There simply was no denomination for her other than battlecruiser. Now we have spoken about Hood, HMS Hood. Why was she a battlecruiser? Why was she a battleship? Wait, we have established she was a battleship, right? I hope we have established that by this point. But now we are going to enter the opposite case. The case of a battlecruiser which was called a battleship, and everyone gladly accepted she was a battleship, while she was not. And I'm looking at you, Japan, and I'm looking at you, Congo class. So Congo was a pre-World War One battlecruiser, which was ordered by Japan. Some people say that she was kind of an evolution of Lion or a copy of Tiger. They are not true. That's simply not true. They were similar in general. Yeah, in armament, more or less configuration, etc. The Tiger class battlecruiser actually took some features from the Japanese design, but they were, let's say, far cousins between them, right? They were similar, but they weren't copies at all. At any rate, they were very good ships at the time. The Lion class battlecruiser was probably the best British battlecruiser of World War One, and yeah, well, the Congos were even better than that. They were better armored, they were better protected, they had even better guns because they had 14-inch guns, while the British ones had 13.5-inch guns. They were a tad faster as well. But of course, well, time passed by, and the Washington Naval Treaty was signed by all the important naval powers of the world, and Japan was binded by that treaty, at least until it expired. So for 15 years, Japan couldn't build new battleships, right? But Japan lived out of their idea of the big battle, right? They had in mind this big clash between the Japanese and the US battle fleets in the middle of the ocean. And they wanted, I mean, they were battle cruisers. The battle cruisers in general, they were not really high prestige units after you'd land. The concept had been highly despised since then. At least the light armor battle cruiser concept, that is. So Japan couldn't build new battleships. In fact, they couldn't build anything bigger than 10,000 tons with guns bigger than 8 inches of caliber. Because the provisions of the Washington Naval Treaty pretty much treated battlecruisers and battleships as equal. Anything bigger than 10,000 tons with guns bigger than 8-inch guns was to be a capital ship. And the tonnage restriction applied to the capital ships, that is, battlecruisers and battleships alike. So Japan was stuck with four quite old battleships, the Fusos and the Ises, four Congo-class battlecruisers, and two pretty modern and pretty powerful Nagaros. Of course, the thing is that if you were listing the Japanese fleet as 6 battleships and 4 battlecruisers, doesn't sound as good, as powerful, and as great as 10 battleships, right? Especially for a fleet which was living out of prestige, as Japan was, especially because they were trying to assault the throne of the US Navy in the Pacific, they needed prestige. They needed to put their battle line at the same level as the US battle line. But it just so happened the US weren't using battle cruisers. They had a shitload of battleships, however, so the Japanese wanted battleships. So, you have 4 battle cruisers, you have 6 battleships. You can't build new battleships. How do you solve this? Well, you turn your battlecruisers into battleships. Yeah. How did they do that? Did they add insane armor amounts? Did they make them super armor, super protected? No. No, they couldn't do that either because the Washington Naval Treaty also explicitly forbade any rebuild or refit of a ship that would increase her displacement over 3,000 tons. So you couldn't add a shitload of armor to a ship and be gone with that. No. Armor is very heavy as well. And yeah, well, what the Japanese did was take the Congo, modify their superstructure, and add a Pagoda class superstructure, which is as it's usually called. And they did add armor. Yes, they upgraded the belt armor, they upgraded the turret armor, and they added some deck armor in some vital spaces, like on top of the magazines. Because obviously, World War One battlecruiser standards of deck armor weren't going to beat any projectile, right? So they did add some armor to those spots. Now, what did they end with? Well, they ended with a ship that had 8 inches of belt armor. 8. That's 200 millimeters of belt armor, right? That's not battleship protection. They did add a little bit of armor to the turrets as well, and they ended up with turrets of 10 inches of armor. 10 inches of armor is what Bismarck had in the aft side of her turrets, not in the front, you know? They ended up just adding 4 inches of deck armor over the magazines, but the rest of the ship had slightly more armor, if any, than the ship as initially built. And we are speaking about a pre-World War One battlecruiser here, let's not forget. So essentially we have a ship which is a battlecruiser, but the Japanese are starting calling her a battleship. Why? Prestige. To make the fleet look a little bit better on paper, because those weren't battleships. Those were able to steam at 30 knots, because another thing the Japanese did was to take the old engines out and put new boilers and new engines, more powerful engines, so they could hit 30 knots. So we have a ship with very weak protection for a capital ship, quite lighter weapons than a battleship, because Japanese battleships of the time have 12 14-inch guns, the Fusos, the Yamashiros, and 8 16-inch guns, the Nagaros. Congo had 8 14-inch guns, and they had a shitload of speed, 30 knots. If we are looking at what a battlecruiser was, a British kind of battlecruiser, even after the rebuilding, the Congos were battlecruisers, and they were called battleships. And finally, another kind of, this one was weird, okay, and this one really should require a chapter on her own, but we'll see about that. But I don't think I'm going to do it. The Scharnhorst class battleships, the German battleships, battleships, not battlecruisers, because everyone insists in, well, not everyone, but a lot of people insist in calling them battlecruisers. Now, again, let's go back to the definition. What's a battlecruiser? The British concept. The British concept was light armor, fast speed, and capital ship weapons, right? Well, Scharnhorst had 14 inches of belt armor. I mean, she had a displacement devoted to armor on the same scale as a North Carolina class battleship had, for instance. In protection levels, it was a battleship. There's no way around that. She was very fast, obviously. 32 knots is extremely quick, but she had very, very light guns. Now, there's a point to call her a battlecruiser, because German battlecruisers were like that. If you remember, I spoke about this at the start of this video. The German battlecruisers of World War One had similar protection levels to a battleship, were really fast, but had lighter weapons than the corresponding battleship. Well, the problem here is that Scharnhorst had no battleship to compare with. Germany had no battleships. So, what do we compare them with? With Bismarcks? Well, the Bismarcks came later on. Well, compared with Bismarck, yeah. The Scharnhorst had more or less roughly the same amount of armor. Not in the decks, however, but belt armor, yeah. More or less equal protection. They had faster speed, slightly faster, 2 knots. 2 knots. It's not that much. And she had lighter guns. But if we are arguing that the Scharnhorst were battlecruisers following the German battlecruiser model, we'll have to expect the young Germans to call them battlecruisers, right? Well, the German denomination for a battlecruiser is Grosskreuzer, or Grosse Kreuzer, or whatever. Yet the Scharnhorst were called Schlachtschiffen. Sorry for my German pronunciation because it's crap, but whatever. Schlachtschiffen means battleships. The Germans called those ships battleships. In fact, everyone called them battleships. The only ones who didn't were, again, the British. But the British had a reason to do that. Because the Germans published these ships as 26,000 tons of displacement in the standard condition, when in real life those ships displaced 33,000 tons in the standard conditions. Of course, the margin of 7,000 tons is very important. So the British looked at the published numbers, which included the speed and the displacement, but not the armor, and they said, okay, a ship that can make 22 knots with 9 11-inch guns and 26,000 tons, well, she can't have a lot of armor, can she? She must be a battlecruiser. No. No. The Scharnhorst were battleships. They were crappy battleships. They were woeful battleships, horrible battleships. Those weapons simply disqualified those battleships as anything worth it. They were worthless ships as battleships, but they were battleships. They were not battlecruisers. A battlecruiser, what's a battlecruiser? A battlecruiser is a ship designed to act as the fast wing of the battle line. The Germans had no battle line, and once they had it, that battle line was able to do 30 knots. With 32 knots, you are not the fast wing of any battle line at all. And another role is a ship that is intended to hunt enemy cruisers, which was never the objective of the Sandhurst. The Sandhurst class battleship was designed from the very beginning. Well, no, not from the very beginning. Initially, it was intended to be an improved version of Deutschland, the Panzerschiffen, the armored ships. Those were actually armored cruisers. But it just happened that the French built a very light battleship called the Dunkerque class. And the Sandhurst were designed to counter those ships. So a ship which is built to counter an enemy capital ship, by definition, is a battleship. Another whole thing is that as built, she's totally worthless, which we will agree, Sandhurst was crap. But no, in no way she was a battlecruiser. There's another factual thing here, and that's very curious, and I think very few people really realize that. If you look at World War One, oh my gosh, World War One ship designs and ship sketches and line drawings, etc., you will notice that German battleships of World War One have, without exception, 3 screws. They have 3 sets of engines, 3 sets of boilers, 3 screws, and 3 shafts, of course. Meanwhile, the German Grosse Kreuzeren, or battlecruisers of World War One, all of them have 4 shafts, 4 screws, 4 shafts, 4 sets of engines, 4 sets of boilers for the engines. And Sandhurst? Well, Bismarck, we all know, had 3 shafts, triple screw. That's the German tradition for battleships. Sandhurst had 3 screws, 3 shafts. So you can see, even from there, because obviously they took a lot of things from World War One, not because they really needed to, because Germany wasn't as backwards in naval design as people tend to think. That's yet another thing that could be covered in another video. But German battlecruisers traditionally had 4 screws. German battleships traditionally had 3 screws. When building Sandhurst and Bismarck, the Germans took a lot of things from tradition of World War One designs. And Sandhurst had 3 screws and 3 shafts. So there it goes. For the Germans, they were designed, built, and intended to be battleships. Now, I'll give anyone who tells me that they were crappy battleships, but they were battleships. So, yeah, history and myths, battleships and battlecruisers. I hope you learned something, I hope you had fun, and I hope, well, this was entertaining to hear. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys, and see you later.